Hello there. Today's topic is Vimsottari Dasas. This is a big deal because this is the most popular way to predict in Vedic astrology, and Vedic astrology is very widely used throughout India, many parts of the rest of the world, so it plays a big part in astrology. And Vimsottari Dasas, it's sometimes spelled with an SH. This happens with a lot of the terms in Vedic astrology. Sometimes they're an S, sometimes they're an SH. And as an American, I'm probably mangling the pronunciation. I think the Indian pronunciation is usually something more like Vimsottari. But I say Vimsottari because I'm an American. My apologies if I'm mangling the word. Okay, so this is the most popular method for forecasting in a large part of the world. What is it? Well, it's a form of dasas. There are many ways of doing dasas, but Vimsottari Dasas are the most popular. So what is a dasa? A dasa is a planetary period. And a planetary period just means you're under the spell, you might say. You're under the influence of a planet. Like maybe today I'm under the influence of Venus, so I'm in love, or I'm under the influence of Saturn, so I'm very melancholic and Sirius or something. So the idea is that you come under the spell or influence of a planet for a period of time. And this idea of being in a dasa, a planetary period where like the rays or the influence of that planet tends to dominate your life, is an idea used in a lot of ancient astrology, very popular in Hellenistic astrology, which is the astrology, Hellenistic, around Greece, around the Middle East, spread throughout Europe and the rest of the world. Then ancient astrology from the early few hundred BC to say 500 AD. Anyway, in the ancient astrology, Hellenistic astrology, they also use something essentially the same as dasas, usually called time lords, which are periods of time that you're under the influence of a planet. And the time lord system, or what we'd call in Vedic astrology dasa system, that's by far the most popular in India, is the Vimsottari Dasas. So if you're a Western astrologer and you don't know much about this, this should open your eyes to how some of the rest of the world does things. If you're not an astrologer at all, I'm going to be talking about how Vedic astrologers are thinking about the world. Trying to speculate on the concept behind it, because it's not usually explained why you're doing this. I think you'll find this interesting as a view into the mind of astrologers. Okay. Specifically Vedic astrologers, which are a huge percentage of astrologers out there. Now, and I started to hint at this in my next slide. These astrology rules are handed down. They tell you, calculate this, and the calculations are incredibly complicated. Thank God for computers in the late 20th and 21st century. I don't know, people must have spent huge amounts of time going through all these detailed calculations. And they tell you these calculations, and in the information that's handed down to us in general, almost always, there isn't a lot of explanation of how they come up with these rules, basically no explanation, or how to think about it, or it just do this, and out comes a result. So it's a bit of a mystery, for the most part, as to how people came up with these ideas, what they were thinking, what the perspective was. We don't know. And more amazing, or just as amazing, is they just kept producing rules and more complex rules and more variations like crazy, and you just inherit this stuff. And some people think it's just nonsense, and whatever it is, it's very complex nonsense. And by the way, what's really important in this, if you want to get into debating where astrology came from, etc., is that historians use primary sources to figure these things out. They don't just assume it. So, a lot of people have ideas. I have ideas. You have ideas. But ultimately, in the academic world, what's done is you look at the sources to try to figure out what people were doing. And in general, we get the rules without explanations of why they have these rules or how they got these rules. Okay, now here's my idea. I'm just guessing. That's all you can do to try to figure out this puzzle of where astrology came from and how people are thinking. is that this idea of dasas, that you're under the spell of a planet, to me is common sense. It's an idea that would easily occur to anybody. The idea that you come under the spell of a different planet. So, for example, Venus, which is all about being beautiful and attractive and harmonious, we could associate that with young women. I'm not trying to be sexist here or judgmental. I'm just trying to talk about how people might think. Young women would seem more Venusian. Young men, you might say traditionally, or in a lot of people's minds, might be more like Mars, more aggressive. They're the ones going out to war. They're the ones, with their guns and arrows and spears or whatever, and charging ahead, and so on. So they would seem to be more like Mars. Nowadays, at least in the modern Western world, we allow for a lot more flexibility of these things. But certainly, as you get older, if you're 80, 90 years old, you don't have the muscular strength, almost always, that you would have had when you were, say, 25 or 30. So there seems to be more Mars when we're younger. And as we get older, we get more like Saturn. We get wiser, quieter, slower. We get closer to death, which is part of Saturn. So, the idea that certain planets are bestowing their rays or blessing, or, they're just giving their power to certain people at certain times, is almost built into the language of astrology. And given that, you can hardly avoid the idea of dasas. So, I've made a graph here, and on the bottom we have age from 0, being born, to say about 80 years old, and here would be Saturn. I mean, this is just sort of an intuitively obvious idea that Saturn seems to get stronger as you get older, right? I'm not saying that this is a fact. I'm saying that this is probably the way of thinking behind a lot of thoughts in astrology. I can hardly imagine how it couldn't be, given how we think of Saturn, what's been said about Saturn from the beginning, and what we know about human life. It's pretty obvious. Or here's Mars, I put in red. We get stronger, more muscular, more athletic, more aggressive. We know that athletes, in almost every sport, once you get past about 40 years old, you're just not likely to be at the top of your game. And Jupiter, if we think of Jupiter as being socially powerful and so on, that usually happens later in life. So I've got it peaking here, say in the early 50s or maybe the 40s. You could argue these points, but it's the basic idea. Mars peaks earlier, Jupiter later, Saturn latest in life. If we look at some of the more newly discovered planets, newly in the last few hundred years, Uranus, rebelliousness seems to be strong among teenagers. Neptune, imagination, fantasy. Children believe in Santa Claus and all this stuff. As you get older and Saturn gets stronger, it seems like Neptune gets weaker. So this idea of, the strength of planets at certain ages, and for certain people, women are more like Venus, men are more like Mars, would seem like a common idea. So I think this is where the intuition behind dasas. It seems so straightforward that it would be hard for it not to be. So that's just a way to think of it. Okay, and here's another thought, is you could think of these planetary periods, instead of being gradual, as being more sudden. So for example, here's Jupiter. All of a sudden in your late 20s, mid to late 20s, some people start earlier, some people later, but on average, somewhere around there you start gaining this more greater social power, and it stays high and then sinks down. And Saturn may be more abrupt. So you could think of them as sudden increases, or you could think of them as more gradual in the past. But more gradual in this graph, or more like sudden shift from one level to another. But in any case, we do change collectively at certain ages. We change how much we're under the influence of a planet. And then individually, each person seems to come under the spell of planets at certain periods of their life. So let's take George Bush, President George W. Bush. I think he's a real interesting case of what seemed to be planetary periods. And I've got his chart here. He was born in the background July 6, 1946. So in 1968 he graduates from Yale. 7 years later he graduates from Harvard. He gets married in 1977. His twin daughters are born in 1981. You know, he becomes politically active, has some success, but then he becomes president from 2000, roughly 2000, 2008. Huge. So he becomes president. He goes through this period of 8 years. You might suspect he's under the dasa, under the spell, maybe of some planet that's dignified, in good position, because he becomes successful, and maybe rules his 10th house of prestige. This would be the idea. For those 8 years, he came under that spell, that power. Some people become president. If the few people who do, when they're younger, some older, this would be that time of high stature and renown, 2000, 2008. Now, he had some difficulties in his presidency, a lot of difficulties. Most presidents do. But he very definitely did, especially towards the end of his 8 years. And so maybe the planet's not completely dignified and perfect, and maybe we would see those problems as well. But that's the idea. Then, I really think this is amazing, and this is why I think George W. Bush is a good example. After his presidency, within a few years, he starts staying home. He spends a lot of time painting, and he's painting like crazy. He's made a huge change from being president of the United States in the public to staying home on his ranch in Texas and taking up painting. So he's not some like good old country boy out with the cows and the chickens all the time. He's inspired in a more artistic and sensitive way. Maybe he went into a dasa related to the 5th house of creativity. So you get the idea, and we could test the idea. We'll look at George Bush to learn the ideas. Okay, so how do you come up with a dasa for a specific person, for George W. Bush? Well, the idea, again, it's kind of intuitively straightforward. You would take some planet or some cycle, like an angle between planets or position of something, and you see how far through the cycle it was when you were born. And Vimsottari Dasas, well, this will become clear when I give the example in Vimsottari Dasas, they're based on what is really the heart, one of the great, not the heart, but one of the great fundamental principles, backbones of Vedic astrology, the Nakshatras. And it's based on the percent the moon is through a nakshatra. I put an exclamation point here because that's really fundamental in Vedic astrology, is the moon and the nakshatra. And I have another tutorial video about nakshatras and dasas, nakshatras and Navamsa charts and what are called padas. But there are 27 nakshatras that go around the zodiac, and each one is 13 degrees 20 minutes in length. And this is the order of the planets. So what happens is these 27 nakshatras. Let me right-click on this wheel for George Bush. I'm in the Sirius 1.3 software, and I'll go over here to the Special tab and pull up the nakshatra wheel. This will help make it clearer. Now this is in the tropical zodiac. I purposely put it in the tropical zodiac, even though in Vedic astrology you would use the sidereal zodiac, but you could have nakshatras in either zodiac in theory. Normally they're in the sidereal zodiac. But these are the 27 nakshatras. And Aries starts with Aries. Whether it's tropical or sidereal will be the same idea. So there's the first nakshatra called Ashwini at the beginning of Aries. It's 13 degrees 20 minutes, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And we find George Bush's moon. We find out what nakshatra it's in, and it's in the. It looks like it's in the beginning of this one here, but what we're going to do is look at it the way it's done in Vedic astrology in the sidereal zodiac in a second. But the idea is to find out what nakshatra the moon is in, and is it towards the end, is it towards the beginning, And each nakshatra is ruled by a different planet for a different number of years. And here in this slide, where's my slide? This is the number of years. I'll slide this over. So K2 is the ruling planet of the first nakshatra. So if the moon goes through this first nakshatra with an influence that lasts 7 years, you're under the influence of K2, which in Western astrology we call the South Node. And Venus is the next nakshatra. So you're under the power of this nakshatra for 20 years with Venus. And then this one for 6 years. Exactly how they come up with the order of the planets in this particular order and this number of years, we don't know. It's just handed down. It totals up to 120 years. There are 9 planets for the first 9 nakshatras, then it repeats for the next 9 and then the last 9. So when you get to the 10th nakshatra, you start over again with K2. So this will become clear in the next slide. I'll show you how this is done for George Bush. Let me slide this back over. And here's how it works for George Bush. His moon is a 23 Virgo 36. Let's look at this. It says here 16 Libra 42, but that's the tropical zodiac. I will go here to Vedic, and I will select chakras, vargas, and tables in the Sirius 1.3 software, and it brings up what we call the Kepler workshop, another module, another part of the Kepler program, of the Sirius program. And here it is in Vedic style, a Vedic style wheel. There is a lot of customizing available, and I've put in this Vedic wheel what sign each house is, and also what house. And I've put the sign as a glyph. This is good for beginners. A lot of Vedic astrologers don't like this, and you can get rid of this or change this. But for us, for learning purposes, it's good. This is the first house with Cancer. I know it's the first house because it says 1. This is the second house. 2 is Leo. Third house is Virgo. So these numbers and signs can help you know which house you're looking at and what the sign is. If you're an experienced Vedic astrologer, you may not like all that there, and you can get rid of it. So there's the moon, 23 Virgo 36. I'm using what's called the Lahiri Ayanamsha, and there it is. Moon at 23 Virgo 36. So, and I could see that, by the way, if I go back here, I could just change this to the sidereal zodiac, and there it shows me moon at 23 Virgo 36, and is clearly, it's in this nakshatra here. We'll see in a minute what nakshatra that is. I'll go back to the Kepler workshop. These are both available simultaneously. I can just click on them in what's called the taskbar in Windows. Anyway, so here is the moon, 23 Virgo 36, and here in this table of information, it tells me the moon nakshatra is Chitra, which is ruled by Mars. Okay, so the Chitra nakshatra is, I go back to my PowerPoint here, it's the 14th nakshatra, and it happens to start at 23 Virgo 20. If you calculate it out, 13 nakshatras times 13 degrees 20 minutes, you'll find that it starts at 23 degrees 20 minutes. It ends at 6 Libra 20. That would be the 6 Libra 40. Oops, typo. That should say 6 Libra 40. Anyway, this spreads, little typo there, 6 Libra 40. So it's 13 degrees 20 minutes in length. And with his moon at 23 Virgo 36, it means it's right at the beginning of Chitra. You see that? If Chitra begins 23 Virgo 20, and it does, his moon is 23 Virgo 36, obviously it's right at the beginning. So what you do is you spread those 7 years of Mars. Mars is 7 years according to our table. We just went back to that table. That 7 years is spread across this nakshatra what happens is that 7 years began just a little bit before he was born. So if you're born in the middle of a nakshatra, you're already halfway through the time period. So if he was born right in the middle of the Chitra nakshatra, he'd have half of the 7 years, 3.5 years left. He's got most of it left, and we'll see what that looks like. Down here, I've got the dasas. And I can look at them, and he was born on July 6th. He was born on July 6th, and this nakshatra began just almost 2 months before he was born. It started on May 17, before he was born. So he's in this Mars dasa. This pink background is the dasa, and these are sometimes called bhuktis, which are subperiods. But let's just look at the pink part of this first. In fact, I can remove these bhuktis if I right-click and I go to the dasa settings, and then down here I click on Vimsottari. Right up here, I've got Vimsottari. I can tell it to not do the second level, just do the first level. Click OK, and scroll down. And now I've got just these are sometimes called the Mahadasas, the main time period. So he's under Mars from May 46 to May 53. From May 53, he's under to May 71, he's under the influence of Rahu. So when he became president, he was in a Saturn dasa. See that? I'll highlight this. So when he became president in the year 2000, he was in a Saturn dasa. And that dasa lasted from 1987 to 2006. His presidency finished in 2008. He changed into the Mercury dasa in 2006. So what does it mean? It means he's all about Saturn. His life is all about Saturn, very Saturn. He's under the spell of Saturn. Is that good? Is that bad? What does it mean? Well, what you can do is look at the chart, which is right here. Saturn is in the first house. And a nice thing is when you put your cursor on the planet, it gives an interpretation over here in the upper right corner. So I put my cursor on Saturn, and in the upper right corner it says, there's very small type, so you may not see it in this video. It's clear in the actual program. It says, the placement of the unfavorable 8th ruler. So what you do in Vedic is similar to some of Western astrology. Saturn is regarded as ruling Capricorn and Aquarius. Here's Aquarius in the 8th house. So Saturn rules the 7th and 8th. And this interpretation detects that the ruler of the 8th is in the 1st, which brings difficulty, because the 8th is a Dushtana house, a sector of loss, deprivation, disease, and misfortune. Many obstacles. So positive aspect replacement by sign, for example, and friendly signs or exaltation can mitigate these influences, but Saturn is in Cancer, which, in Vedic astrology that's not so bad, but it's in modern Western, that would be the opposite of the sign it rules. Anyway, some difficulty there. So becoming president in the Saturn dasa, where Saturn rules the 8th house, is going to bring difficulty. So what's nice here is you can look at the dasa, then find out where that planet is in the chart. You can see what houses it rules, and you can also read a little idea. This was written by astrologer Disussion, who's in Australia, Vedic astrologer there, who wrote these interpretations for us. It's very handy to have, especially if you're just trying to learn and get your grips on how to deal with these interpretations. So there you have it. We would expect difficulty if we were, choosing the president, if we were members of the Republican Party, picking president. There might have been a better time for George Bush to become president rather than this time period with his Saturn dasa and Saturn ruling the 8th house. So this is how the forecasting was done. To summarize, it's based on the nakshatras. Each nakshatra is ruled by a planet. You see how far through the nakshatra the planet is, and then that planet rules for a certain number of years. And then in 2006, towards the end of his presidency, he was elected for 2 terms, so halfway through the second term, he goes into a Mercury dasa. Mercury is also in the first house. Mercury rules the 3rd house, of Virgo. It also rules the 12th house. Now, the 12th house is a difficult house, not usually good for being president or social prominence. So that's not good either. He's got the Saturn rules the 8th, which is a Dushtana house. Mercury rules the 12th, which is a Dushtana house. Not good. Not the best time for him to have become president. But it also rules the 3rd, so there's some good news with that. Actually, there's a lot of, he gives the interpretations for both here. So I put this Mercury there, and then I can move my cursor over and scroll through this whole section. So ruler of the 12th here gives many results depending on other planets. It's good for charitable and spiritual disposition. It's good for more spiritual kind of work. And being behind the scenes, actually what he did after his presidency, being home and working on painting and stuff like this, and he does charitable works from his home very quietly and behind the scenes. That's actually more appropriate and probably more successful in a lot of ways. I'm not trying to knock him as a president. I'm trying to say it wasn't the best timing for him as a president. Whether you're a liberal or conservative, whatever your political views were, according to astrology, it was not the best time for him to become president, according to these Vedic predictive method of Vimsottari Dasas. So, I'm very quickly here, 26 minutes into this lecture, giving you an idea of what Vimsottari Dasas are all about. What you do, the computer does it for you, is you find out where the moon is, how far through the Nakshatra is, what planet rules the Nakshatra, how many years are left for you to be under the spell of that planet, and George W. Bush was under the spell of Saturn from 1987 to 2006. He's currently under the spell of Mercury, and you don't just say Mercury thinking, you also look at it where it is in the chart. It's in the 1st house, and what houses does it rule? It rules the 3rd and 12th. And the houses that the planet rules are very important. So it is good for presidency in the sense that it's in the 1st house. It's prominent, it's angular, it's in his, it's with his what we call lagna in Vedic astrology. So that's good. But the fact that, Saturn rules the 8th, which is not a good house for public activity, and then he goes into a Mercury Dasa, which rules the 12th. You could say that's even worse for these kinds of things. You'd be much better dealing with more spiritual things, more charitable things, and so on. And I think he's got more of an opportunity to focus on that after being president. And he seems to be happy and seems to be more in his element and doing the right thing. He's more in tune with what this predictive method would say. So that's how the interpretation basically works. Now we can go to the Bukti level, which we saw a minute ago, and see more details. So if I right-click, by the way, here are all different kinds of information that we can display in this box. And I've unchecked the Shadbala graphs, the Upagrahas, the Bhavaruta, the special Lagnas, the Varshapal information, the Saham information, because I just want to have the basic information and the dasas. Because that's all I want for this particular lecture. So this is a wonderful interface where you can see exactly what you want to see. Now at the top here I've got what I want to change. I'll go to dasas, the Vimsottari Dasa. Let's include the Buktis, which is a 2nd level. I could also include a 3rd level. But we'll just include the Buktis. And by the way, down here under Dasa specific settings, you can also include interpretations. I'm not going to show that right now in this video, but the most important thing right now is I want to show you that you can get these other levels. I'll just click OK, and it recalculates, and then we see what I had up here originally, and we can get to more detail. And let's go down to the current time period. I'm making this video in 2014. So his presidency ended in 2008. Right after his presidency, he went into a Venus Bukti. Notice his Venus in the 1st house, ruling the 11th. That's where Taurus is. Where is Libra? The 4th. If you're not used to these wheels, I've got these like trainer wheel that helps you know what the sign and house is. So it rules the 11th and the 4th. The Venus is in Cancer in the first house. And sure enough, he gets into painting. And he's in this Venus Bhukti from 2009 to 2012, but he stays with the painting after that Bhukti. So maybe that's not enough to explain it. He goes into the Sun Bhukti and the Moon Bhukti. They're lasting about a year each. Moon lasts a half year, and then 2014 Mars. So these are smaller time periods of a few years. We'll see that the Rahu period is 3 years, and these are the same proportion as the main cycle. Basically, you take the main periods, which I'll go back. This thing, you'll notice Rahu and Jupiter, Saturn, and Mercury get a lot of time, and Venus, so they're going to get proportionally more time. Sun and Ketu and Mars get relatively little time, 6, 7, and 7 years. And the same will happen with the Bhukti, where the Sun and Moon get less time, the same proportion that's used in the main period. It's the same period repeated within a period. And that's the Bhukti. And then you can go to another level of, some people can go to 4 and 5 levels and get down to days that they last. So that's it. I've really covered just about everything. Let me see if I have anything else in my notes here. I mentioned here we can look at the planets in the chart, read the interpretation, and by that, the interpretation I'm referring to here is the interpretation of the planet, to get a feeling, to inspire your thoughts about what Mercury in the first house would mean. It'll remind you what houses it's ruling, how to think about that, because that's what's going to come to prominence during the Mercury Dasa, for example. Bush is going to be under the influence of that Mercury in the first house, ruling the 12th, ruling the third house, and I can go over here and read about the ruler of the third in the first, scroll back up, ruler of the 12th in the first, to get more ideas about specifically what's going to happen during that Dasa. I could also pull up the Dasa interpretations by checking that box I showed you before, but I think looking at this rulership business will really help. So you can really investigate these dasas for yourself, see if they make sense, see what dasa you're in, what bhukti you're in, see what house that's in according to Vedic astrology, see what houses it rules, and see if the basic idea works or not. It's a lot of fun. Whether it works or not, you have an idea of how to do the forecasting, what the basic concept is, and I've given also an idea of how this idea comes about, this idea that you're under the spell of a planet. If you're a Western astrologer and you first hear about this stuff, it might sound weird, like I'm in a, Venus period for 20 years. Very different way of thinking as opposed to transits, might seem a little more concrete. Here's where the planets are in the sky. I overlay them where they were when I was born, or secondary progressions where the chart evolves over time. Those are very different ways of thinking as opposed to planetary periods. And you can use all of these ways of thinking, all these models for how planetary influences might work, and people in Vedic astrologers, some of them use dasas and they use transits in various ways as well. And many use aspects. So it's just another way of thinking about it. So that's dasas. I think I'm done. Yep, that's it. Big deal. Vimsottari Dasas, huge forecasting method used by thousands of astrologers. To tell people what's going to happen, to predict for famous people, etc. You have an idea of what it's about now, where it comes from, and a way of thinking about why it might be affected, or at least how people came up with the idea. Okay, my friends, thank you for watching this video. Take care. God bless. Namaste.